European Russian Eurasian Studies here at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. This event is co-sponsored by the Institute, which we call IRES, and the Program on New Approaches towards Research and Security in Eurasia, or PONAR's Eurasia. And one of the things that PONAR's Eurasia and IRES likes to do is try and introduce new books that are of exceptional importance to a broader community and subject them to some discussion. So in this case, it's not formally a book launch because the book actually isn't out yet, but we have a few kind of preview, kind of advanced copies that were given to us. So it's kind of a book preview and discussion. And we're very fortunate here to have a very interesting book to discuss. It's called Tug of War, Negotiating Security in Eurasia. And one of the two co-editors, Mikhail Troitsky, is here to, he'll lead off the discussion today. The other co-editor is Fen Osler-Hampson. Just for those of you who are I mean, probably I think they need no introduction, but I'll still say Mikhail is Associate Professor and Dean of the School of Government and International Affairs at MGIMO in Moscow, one of the premier institutions, certainly for international affairs study in Russia. And also a professor in the IMARIS master's program at the European University at St. Petersburg. Also joining us for the discussion will be two of the contributors to the volume. So first of all, I think the first one to speak will be William Zartman, who is Jacob Blaustein Distinguished Professor Emeritus of International Organizations and Conflict Resolution at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And then we'll also have Terence Hauptman, who is Professor of International Relations in the Conflict Management Program also at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And then kind of helping kind of spice up the discussion will be comments from a discussant, Daniel Server, also at Johns Hopkins SAIS, is Professor of Practice of Conflict Management and Director of the Conflict Management Program, as well as a Senior Fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at SAIS. So I think, without further ado, we can turn things over to Mikhail Troitsky to get things started, and then we'll, the other two contributors will make some remarks about their contributions or other insights they might want to share, and then we'll turn to Professor Server for his comments, and then we'll open things up for discussion. So again, thank you for braving the cold today.
Thank you very much, Professor Hale, and I'll just deliver a very brief introduction. First off, we are very grateful to GW and the Elliott School and PONAR's Eurasia for actually volunteering to hold this book discussion today. And so this book was co-authored by an international group of scholars. Most of them are associated with what is called the Process of International Negotiation Group, or PIN. And the book itself was conceived in the fall of 2015 and largely written and edited in the second half of this year. So it's kind of new and fairly an update in terms of our analysis. We also acknowledge the immense contribution of Fen Osler-Hampson, our co-editor, who is unable to be here today, and also of the Center for International Governance Innovation and McGill University Press that transformed our post-review manuscript into this glossy volume in just a couple of months this year. Now, why Tug of War on the cover, and what's new about this book? This notion of Tug of War essentially describes the setup for the book. That's the competition for what we call security order ownership in post-Soviet Eurasia and its surroundings. And that struggle, that tug of war, involves a global power and a few status-thirsty trans-regional powers, including the European Union, China, and Russia. We, of course, do not overemphasize power or whatever raw geopolitics, because our analysis is very much process-based. We are interested in negotiation as a process, but we do believe that competition and, at times, open conflict rather than cooperation, are still making the day in Eurasia. There are definitely some clashing aspirations among the bigger players and between those bigger players and smaller players in Eurasia. Now, post-Soviet Eurasia is a major playing field in the game for status, and status is an intriguing concept for the students of negotiation, because status derives from negotiation, usually explicit negotiation, but sometimes tacit negotiation. And in Eurasia, whoever ends up with widely recognized rights to shape alliance affiliations and foreign policy orientations and domestic politics in post-Soviet Eurasian countries, that actor will prove its viability and resilience as a global actor. Moscow thinks it is capable of rolling the United States back in Eurasia and beyond, and thereby asserting its status of a global power. And while Washington thinks that history is largely on its side, and Moscow and whoever else favoring foreign policy grandstanding at the expense of economic advancement will have to back off soon. So that's the setup. And Eurasia is also notable for a wide variety of negotiating actors, from the global superpower to those large revisionist nations, to smaller states, to separatist movements, and quasi-states, to integration blocs. All of them come together in those sets of negotiations that we analyze in the book. And it all makes the study of negotiation in Eurasia indeed exciting and productive in terms of lessons for both theory and practice. But we are, in fact, as I just said, interested in the process of negotiation. We are asking ourselves, first of all, when do negotiations occur? Then how the positions of the sides in a number of conflicts have evolved during negotiation and why. And we are also trying to see if negotiation as a mode of collective decision-making can actually be helpful in diffusing conflicts, and also in laying the basis for sustainable deals to resolve long-standing disputes. And we actually find in that book that negotiation in Eurasia has been effective in both highly antagonistic and also less intense coordination contexts. But it has also been ineffective in both of these situations. For example, negotiation did help to stop the wars in Nagorno-Karabakh in '94, in Georgia in 2008, and also to an extent in eastern Ukraine in 2015. But negotiation also did not help to stem the very intense controversy over Crimea in 2014, and it is not helping a lot in the current confrontation between Russia and the United States across Eurasia, and primarily in post-Soviet Eurasia. Now, in less intense contexts, negotiation helped to keep the differences on the enlargement of NATO under control for about 2 decades, and we have a good chapter on that process in the book. And negotiation also helped to resolve the controversies over China's borders with former Soviet republics. But negotiation did not help to define a full legal framework for the Caspian Sea, for example, or to reach a sustainable solution for Moldova and Transnistria. So, quite in line with the existing theories, negotiation was helpful in Eurasia when the stalemate was especially hurting, or when it was clear that an alternative to engagement, to engaging in negotiation was too risky. And we also find in that book that in Eurasia, status and identity are no less important obstacles to negotiation than the distribution of forces among players. For example, the European Union and Russia were so keen to assert their status as effective problem solvers in post-Soviet Eurasia that they didn't even consider trilateral negotiation or consultations about Ukraine's association agreement before the agreement was made final, and sparked a major and I believe an avoidable controversy within Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. So if you think in terms of identity, you'll see that the controversy over NATO enlargement goes back to Russia's choice of identity in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, as a foreign policy successor to the Soviet Union. Or if you look, as one of the chapters does in this book, at Armenia and Turkey, you'll see that their reconciliation is hampered primarily by virulent identity politics in both countries. So I'd probably stop the discussion, stop at this point discussing the major takeaways from our book in terms of both practice and theory, and turn it over to the two of our authors who kindly agreed to be here today to present their own findings and beyond.
Okay, I think Professor Zartman is going first.
Thank you. We at SAIS always look with interest at what's going on in Eliot, and I must say I'm enormously impressed today on a day when it's a Friday and interterm, and the temperature is what the radio people call minus 12. 12 is always minus below 32. We have as large a group here as we've got, so I'm impressed, and I thank you for being here. My chapter is on a relatively small case, but a case that I think really is the microcosm of the kind of situation, problem situation that we're looking at in negotiations in the near or abroad, negotiations around the rim of Russia, and involving a lot of what was parts of the former Soviet Union. My chapter has to do with the Caspian. And I want to give a quick rundown of what the problem of the Caspian is, and then talk about some things that struck me as I looked at the situation, negotiation, if you will, as I'll explain more, that took place over the past 30 years, really. 20 years, yeah. The Caspian Sea, the Caspian Sea, up till the breakup of the Soviet Union, was governed by a treaty in 1940, from 1940, which it gave absolute dominance of the Soviet Union over the body of water. During that time, it was not particularly rich in anything except sturgeon, and therefore caviar. The southern part of the Caspian was occupied by Iran on a curious border that ran from one border point on one shore to the other, but made no attempt to get any equal distribution or even fair distribution of the Caspian to the southern neighbor. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, this all fell apart. And suddenly, instead of two countries being literal states on the Caspian, there were five. Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan suddenly joined, and they claimed their part of the Caspian. But how do we define part of the Caspian? How does one feel when suddenly has been cut back, as Russia then was, to a small part of the shore, and not the richest part of the bottom in this lake that was, or is a sea or a lake, that was formerly essentially within the Soviet Union. So this raised a number of problems, including the boundaries, the ownership of resources, the distribution of access, and first of all, the problem that I think dominates this book, what I call PIWS, P-I-W-S, the Post-Imperial Withdrawal Syndrome. Post-Imperial Withdrawal Syndrome is what happens when you have a country that is a major player and suddenly is reduced to being a lesser player, maybe only a player among many. And although this is not a statement about the whole position of Russia, it certainly is a statement about the position of Russia in the Caspian Sea, as I already indicated. Along with Tehran, it is now present with 4 other states and dealing with the sea. This was such a shock to Russia that it took almost a decade for Russia to get a Caspian policy together. Then after that, in various ways of negotiation, it worked out some problems that it was left with when its influence and when its dominance was reduced. Now, these words influence and dominance are important in this dealing with PUSE, the Post-Imperial Withdrawal syndrome, because it had a dominant position before, and now it's faced with 4 equally sovereign countries, and sovereign countries which have all came into being with a chip in their shoulder. The 3 new countries, the former republics of the Soviet Union, were very touchy about, like any post-colonial country, were touchy about their sovereignty, and wanted to be any kind of move was looked at as something dangerous to their new status. And of course, Iran to the south was very touchy about its position as a new Islamic republic. So dominance then was a challenge, and yet it was something that Russia was used to within the region, and in being used to it, and meeting with the countries that were equally careful about their own status position, but from a weaker side, it set up a situation of after '98. Of great rivalry, attention to what was going on in the Caspian. And of course this was exacerbated by the fact that now it was all the shores were, and the bottom, were rich with oil. It was new, but it now was discovered as a major resource. And the oil was primarily in the southern part of the Caspian Sea, although to some extent also to the northeast. Southern part of the Caspian Sea is the area where Iran, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan operate. In the northeast is an area where Russia and Kazakhstan come into conflict about their boundaries. And therefore their relations then were not simply relations of ownership of land and water, nor relations of dominance and influence, but also relations of access to raw materials. So how did negotiations come into play in dealing with these various problems? And before I go into 2 major types of problems and the way that they were worked out, one thing that struck me in looking at this situation was that I came across what I would call a different kind of negotiation, by no means new, but a different kind of negotiation than we're usually used to treating when we talk about giving something to get something, or a negotiation, the meeting of 2 positions into two opposing positions into a common decision. And different too from what we've been talking about, I think more recently, different from the idea of tacit negotiations. That is, I make a move, but I don't talk to you about it. I just make the move, and then you make a move, and then we see whether they fit together. It's what I would call structural negotiations. That is, in which parties make a move, and that changes the chessboard. It changes what we each have, and then what we're trying to get on the basis of that situation. And then in response, the other party makes a move, but makes a move as a fait accompli, makes a move that either affects directly the status of the land or water or something, or it brings in a new change in the situation. And this is not negotiated back and forth, and yet it changes the board on which the negotiations take place. And so we go back and forth in these moves, but they are not something that is, quote, negotiated together. And if this is abstract, I meant it to be at this point, I'll make it more concrete when we come to the cases that were involved. Second or third, what I found interesting about this is that this was a situation of market asymmetry. But asymmetry in which, if we go back to Pew's, asymmetry in which the sense of strength was not always equal to the degree of strength or power that a party had. So when we're talking about asymmetry, what are we talking about? The real power of the parties being unequal? How do you measure power? And political science has never been able to come up with a decent answer to that, although it's our basic concept, which is rather embarrassing. Or is it rather, more meaningfully, the perception of power? That is, we think he's a big power, and so we act in accordance with that perception. Jeff Rubin edited a book which talks a good deal about the perception of power, called, oddly enough, Power and Negotiation. And if we're talking about perception of power, whose perception? The other party's perception or my own perception? And we found out that if we think of ourselves as a big power, we act in a particular way. And if the other party doesn't agree with us, they don't have a mirror image of our view of perception, but they have their own perception and operate on that basis. Well, there's this very interesting specific case about this. All the issues of the Caspian Sea were up for grabs, where were the boundaries, who owned what, and so on. And Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, said, what we've got is common ownership of this. Common ownership of the whole sea or lake. And common ownership, of course, meant that the strongest power would be the deciding factor in the ownership. And the other states said, no, we're a little uncomfortable with that. We think we ought to have particular sectors of the sea. And Russia said, no, we don't want sectors, we want common ownership. Upon which, in 1994, little Azerbaijan, signed a contract called the Contract of the Century, in which they assigned mining rights for foreign companies in its Caspian Sea. Well, now, what do we mean by its Caspian Sea if there's common ownership? And it had therefore declared that the Caspian would be divided up into sectors and would be a part of sovereign territory of at least one state, that is Azerbaijan. Well, once you do that, about all borders have two sides. So the other side was affected by, was given a border that it had to deal with by this kind of action. Contract of the Century, because of its size, because of the fact that it was made with parties outside of the Caspian area, and because it suddenly had declared what would be the status of ownership within the Caspian Sea. 94. It took 4 years then, 4 more years, for and other countries to say, well, you know, if we've got a border, we must have some more borders which take in our whole territory. And so Kazakhstan and Russia changed. Kazakhstan picked up the idea of ownership, of bordered ownership, and Russia then joined, saying, "You better defend my ownership since I've been given a border, and there's another border coming up with Kazakhstan." And suddenly, the weaker powers, Azerbaijan first of all, and then Kazakhstan, imposed on Russia a new status for the ownership within the Caspian Sea. That kept on going. What's left then is Turkmenistan, and they put it into their constitution. And what do we got left? We've got Iran saying, no, I don't agree. And I think that the Caspian Sea should be divided up into equal parts. Every state gets 20% of it. Well, part of Iran's 20% was already gone by the claims of Azerbaijan and the claims of Turkmenistan, and Tehran is left there saying, I don't agree, but nobody would agree with its disagreement. And so, as Mikhail has said, we still don't have a full agreement on the borders and on the division of the area. But in this asymmetric situation, a little state came up and upset the apple cart. Another thing that I found interesting in it was the idea of regimes, setting up regimes. There was a regime, I've already said, the dominance of Russia, Soviet Union over the area, and common ownership being Russia with a little piece of Iran. But now, since that was all torn apart, how do you set up a new regime? We have said we have step by step claimed pieces of territory, land and sea in the Caspian. But how do you set up a boundary, and what shall we agree on? Azerbaijan set up its boundary unilaterally, but what about the rest, the people who were also on the other side of the boundaries? And in this process of dividing land ownership, bit by bit, the idea was installed. There is one boundary down the middle, which is a common boundary, but where shall that be? On the Talweg, on the lowest part, on the equidistant part, and so on. And gradually they picked up the idea of the modified median line. The median line makes sense, but there were parts where the median line cut right through some oil areas. And so we had to decide, what do you do in that case? And so it became the modified median line. And that was carried on to the point where it was adopted by all the parties, bit by bit, as they went down south to meet Iran, and a new formula for a regime. The regime governing the division of the Caspian Sea was set up. Finally, a last point that I found interesting in this was the question of BATNA, or security point in negotiation. I think that the strongest candidate for a definition of power in negotiation is BATNA. How big is your alternative, your best alternative to negotiation? You can be a tough negotiator if your BATNA is so close to what you would get by negotiation that it really doesn't matter. And you're a weak negotiator, you're in a weak position, much different from the asymmetrical idea that I talked about before. You're in a weak position if your security point is very low. I can't get anything near what I would get by negotiation, no matter how it would turn out, if I don't negotiate. But then in negotiating, the parties not only negotiate against with their security point, on the basis of their security point, but they change the security points and they negotiate against each other's security point. And we have some interesting cases in the Caspian that illustrated this. One I've already talked about. Azerbaijan said, Russia's going to tell us what the regime is for the Caspian Sea. We'll set up a new type of security point, a new alternative to a negotiated agreement. That is, we'll sign the contract of the century with foreign oil companies. And now, in the structural negotiation situation, now let's see what you're going to do to that. And I've spelled out what they did to that. Another interesting case, and I'll end on this, was the case of Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan owed Russia lots of money because Russia had inflated prices on the gas that it was selling to oil, I guess it was, selling to Turkmenistan, and so Turkmenistan defaulted. And so Turkmenistan said, well, if you're going to be like that, we won't sell you any gas. We'll sell it to China instead. a new BATNA, a new alternative that strengthened its position in negotiating with Russia. And then Russia took countermeasures and in the structural negotiation, and on it went. So the Caspian, in a word, is rich in learning about negotiation as well as learning about the status, problems, and answers of Russia after the Soviet Union.
Okay, great. Thanks, Professor Hoffman.
Thank you. Again, let me add my thanks to all of you for coming out on this cold Friday afternoon. It's a pleasure to see so many people here. My paper focuses on the conflicts in Ukraine, and part of the main focus of my paper is to compare the crisis involving Crimea, which occurred in the early 1990s as the Soviet Union was breaking apart and immediately following the breakup of the Soviet Union, with the crisis that again began in 2014, not only in Crimea, but of course subsequently in the Donbass region and Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. And part of the contrast here, I think, basically runs around the difference between preventive diplomacy. My friend Michael Lund here, who inspired an earlier work that I did in Crimea in some sense, which was a kind of classic case, it seems to me, of preventive diplomacy, and indeed effective preventive diplomacy conducted largely by the then Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe's High Commissioner on National Minorities, Max van der Stoel, in a process which is often referred to as seminar diplomacy, where after the Crimean election voted to secede from Ukraine and either to become independent or join up with Russia, a long series of seminars were held among experts on issues like constitutional law and a wide variety of other issues about international conflict between leaders in Crimea and leaders in Ukraine, mediated largely by van der Stoel, and the result was an agreement it occurred in stages, but by 1996 at least, the bringing together of the constitutions of Crimea and Ukraine, in which Crimea was given a high degree of autonomy within the state of Ukraine, but the state borders of Ukraine, which had been recognized by the international community in December of 1991, were preserved. And the other agreements that came out also regarding Ukraine's decision to give up nuclear weapons again in Budapest, which were recognized also obviously by Russia, was again reaffirmed. At the same time, again, that the Crimean populace was given a large degree of autonomy. And this process, I think, worked to a large degree. There were undoubtedly tensions and problems, but to a large degree at least remained relatively dormant until the crisis of 2014, when the horse and cart were kind of reversed. In this case, obviously, following the collapse of the government in Kiev, and Yanukovych's fleeing to Russia, immediately, of course, the Crimeans sought independence with a good deal of support from the so-called Green Men, and subsequently, as everyone knows, I think shortly thereafter, conflict broke out in Donetsk, which had, of course, already been a region, the region that is, along with Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, were the only oblasts within Ukraine that did not have a majority of people who identified in surveys as being Ukrainian in terms of their national identity. And this then, of course, led to conflicts in both cases, but the military process completely preceded the process of negotiation, and therefore the negotiation process surrounding both of these conflicts, primarily around Donbass, because there have been no effective negotiations really around Crimea. The fait accompli, for better or for worse, has been more or less tacitly accepted by the parties, not happily by all of them, but nonetheless, there have been no major efforts to change it. But the primary focus of negotiations has shifted, of course, to the conflict in the Donbass and an effort to resolve that conflict. But again, we have the kind of classic case, it seems to me, where there was a very significant difference in the way in which the parties approached negotiations and in the kind of mediation process that was involved when this was a case of conflict prevention, when the parties recognized that violent conflict was a possibility, but recognized also that with effective diplomacy, they could head off, crossing the Rubicon of violence versus what happened in 2014, where the violence preceded the negotiations. And now the negotiations have been trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, rather than preventing Humpty Dumpty from falling off of the wall, and therefore have been confronted with a number of difficulties and challenges that we did not face during those earlier, during that earlier conflict, when again an effective negotiation process was engaged quite early on. Now, from a theoretical point of view, in terms of broad IR theory, I think one could look at three different kinds of schools of explanations. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but obviously realists, I think, will largely interpret the change as one in the change in the power relationships, particularly following 1999 and 2000 and the arrival of Putin to power in Russia, who in some sense has, to borrow a phrase from his American admirer, made Russia great again after the humiliation of the 1990s. And therefore also has been asserting also a sense of identity of the Russian nation and of the identity of ethnic Russians as being part of Russia, whether or not they lived within the state of the Russian Federation. But the power relationship and Russia's position in international relations clearly changed. A second factor from a more liberal institutionalist point of view, and a major focus of much of my research, has been on the role of European security institutions, particularly the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was viewed to a large degree in the early 1990s by Russia as really the major alternative to major alliances. After the Warsaw Pact disappeared, many Russians believed that the OSCE could replace NATO and the Warsaw Pact as a real pan-European security institution. And there were hopes for that, I think, throughout the 90s. There were certainly debates within the Russian foreign policy establishment about that. But certainly, particularly after 1999 and the Kosovo decision, when NATO made a decision to use military power against Serbia without a mandate from either the United Nations or the OSCE, which they had been promised beforehand, led, I think, to the Russians, to a large degree at least, delegitimizing these liberal international institutions. And that, in some sense, means that they have no longer received the respect and support that they once had. And finally, of course, we have the development further of this conflict of identity in post-Soviet space, and in particular the identity of what it means to be Ukrainian and what it means to be Russian, and the way those narratives of that identity have been constructed historically, but have been reconstructed again over the last decade and a half particularly, seems to be, again, to have accounted for a large part of the difference between the situation we faced in 2014 compared to the early 1990s. So in some sense, it seems to me you need to bring in all three approaches to international relations theory, at least. And in some sense here, they're complementary, I think, in explaining this difference. So let me now just turn a little bit to the negotiation process itself. As I think everyone here knows, the major mediation process has involved a combination of institutions that are kind of intertwined with one another, often referred to as the Normandy process and the Minsk process. The Normandy process, of course, came out of meetings between France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine at the Normandy battlefield in June of 2014. But they created, along with the OSCE, the trilateral contact group, chaired by the chairperson and office of the OSCE, and involving primarily Russia and Ukraine, with observer status or unofficial status given to representatives of the self-declared Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. And they have, as I think everyone knows, negotiated two agreements. The first was in September of 2014, known as Minsk I, which basically was a ceasefire agreement, but a ceasefire agreement that never took hold, which then led to a second round Minsk negotiation in February of 2015, in which, again, another ceasefire was declared, but in this case, the parties were required to withdraw various categories of military hardware in three different zones back behind the line of contact. And the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission was created, which today consists of a little over 700 international monitors, 600 of whom are in eastern Ukraine, and the other 100 are in other parts of Ukraine, Kiev, Lviv, and other parts of western Ukraine, to observe the conflict. These are unarmed observers. Many of them are former military, so they're used to being in combat zones, but nonetheless, their job is to report, and they issue very detailed daily reports, which unfortunately continue to show every day. Today, I think, was the first day in a long time, that is yesterday, today's report, that there were no violations reported in Lugansk for the first time in months and months and months. But nonetheless, the general tendency has been to report literally hundreds of violations of the ceasefire part of the Minsk agreement. But Minsk II also did contain basically the formula for an eventual settlement of the conflict, not all that different from the formula that emerged in the mid-1990s over Crimea, namely that there would be a decentralization of power in Ukraine, including significant regional autonomy with regional elections of local officials. There would be a withdrawal of all foreign fighters and a restoration of Ukraine's state borders in the east, that is to say, a recognition of the Ukrainian-Russian border as it emerged when the Soviet Union broke apart in December of 1991. And again, this was to be monitored by the OSCE, but the details, of course, remain to be negotiated in subsequent negotiations. And here we've gotten kind of a chicken and egg problem. Basically, Ukraine and its supporters in the West have argued that you can't really move on to decentralization and certainly can't hold elections and set up regional authorities in the East while there is active conflict going on. And on the other hand, the representatives of the two breakaway regions have argued in these negotiations that decentralization must at least be agreed to in detail in principle before they're willing to completely give it up in terms of the military fighting. And the result is, of course, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, remains, at the moment, it seems, an insoluble problem. So far there are, at this point, bi-weekly meetings in Minsk. And there are 4 working groups trying to deal with various aspects of the conflict. But so far these have focused far more on the management of the conflict and trying to protect and prevent any further significant damage to the civilian population, and generally improving living conditions near and around the line of contact, rather than moving forward on actually resolving the underlying issues in the conflict. So there's a security working group that has worked on ceasefire implementation, but mostly now on things like civilian security. Can children go to school without worried about being bombed or shot going to and from school? And things like that. So they've tried to have special ceasefires at the beginning of the school year and so forth. An economic working group which has had some success in reopening infrastructural linkages across the line of contact, allowing water, gas, and financial transactions, at least some of them, to take place between the Ukrainian state and the breakaway regions. The third group is a humanitarian one that focuses primarily on victims and on safe passage for civilians across the line of contact. And recently also has brokered several exchanges of prisoners of war between the two sides, just within the last week or so. And finally, there's a political working group which is working on creating modalities for eventual elections in Donbass after an effective ceasefire. But of course, those modalities will not be agreed upon again, presumably, or certainly not implemented at least, until the ceasefire is reached. So again, the focus has been more on conflict management than on conflict resolution. Let me conclude with just a few observations then about negotiation theory. What's going on here in the negotiations? And I think there are 4 possibly, again, probably mutually reinforcing explanations of the current negotiation process. One goes back to one of the very early books on negotiation, Fred Charles Eclay's book in 1964, How Nations Negotiate, in which Eclay identifies one category of negotiations that does not pursue concrete outcomes, but is what he calls negotiation for side effects. Side effects such as the propaganda value or other political benefits with one's domestic constituency, trying to appear to the international community as wanting an agreement, while not really wanting an agreement. In some sense, there's some reason to believe, I think, that neither party really wants a negotiated agreement at this point, in part for political reasons. The leadership, of course, in Lugansk was recently overthrown in a coup, but the leadership in both regions now have a good deal of political perks, as well as probably some access to various economic perks through various illegal mechanisms that they might lose if indeed they became simply a federal entity in a federal Ukraine. And there seems to be some concern in the government in Kiev that if people in these regions could vote, that the current government, that Poroshenko might not survive an election, that these people voting who boycotted the last election might actually be able to defeat Poroshenko, giving him not as much incentive as might otherwise be the case to come up with a final solution to this negotiation as well. So there's some potential loss for both parties if there were actually a settled agreement. Related to that is a slight change in one of Bill Zartman's classic arguments, what Bill called an S5 situation, which was, in his case, a stable, soft, self-serving stalemate. So I've called this situation a US4, not United States, but unstable, soft, self-serving stalemate. It's unstable in the sense, obviously, that the violence could escalate, and there is certainly a possibility if the United States and/or Russia provides more military aid to the various sides. Some think it might lead to moving the negotiations forward, but there are others who are very much concerned, of course, that it could actually lead to an escalation of the conflict and the further inflaming of violence in the region. But in any case, at the same time, there's been no change in the line of contact. There's a lot of fighting going back and forth on both sides of the line of contact, but basically the situation remains fundamentally, on military terms, a stalemate. And neither side, under present circumstances, believes, I think, that it can win militarily without a good deal of external aid. I know from a lot of interviews with Ukrainians that I did last year that none of the participants in Ukraine really believe that they can win. Some may talk as if they can, but I don't think they really do. A third problem with the negotiations is in the somewhat ambiguous role of participants. That is, we've got a strange situation here where in some sense the mediators are also the parties to the conflict. That is, in one sense the OSCE is a special mediator, but it doesn't have really carrots or sticks to offer. And the other two major parties in this trilateral process, of course, are Russia and Ukraine. Two parties that are very much engaged in this conflict. How do you have a mediated settlement produced by parties that are actually engaged in the conflict itself? And therefore, the mediation has focused, as I think the OSCE people will recognize now, largely not on pushing a further settlement because there appears to be no interest in doing so, but again focused almost entirely on trying to improve conditions on the ground and protect civilians and generally improve the livelihood of people in the region from the very desperate conditions in which they have been living since this war broke out in 2014. And the final explanation, again, and goes back to the preventive diplomacy argument, is the facts on the ground. Confronted with a fait accompli, confronted with a situation where there was no effort to engage in serious negotiations of these issues before the military action began, it's been very difficult again to stop the military action, to allow any kind of meaningful negotiations about implementation of an agreement, implementation even of the terms of Minsk to move forward. So again, this is in many ways, it seems to me, the classic case of the benefits of preventive diplomacy, the incredible difference it makes if diplomatic interventions can occur before violence, and the four greater challenges that we face, particularly when we have violent conflicts, and particularly when we have very large parties and powerful parties that are very much committed to their cause and that are not terribly interested in seeking a diplomatic solution, really present some very difficult challenges for the negotiators. And the best mediators in the world, any of the best mediators in the world, it seems to me right now, would have a very difficult time trying to come up with a fundamental resolution to the conflict at least to the basic underlying issues of the conflict. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it was a terrific summary of the concept of the book, and then two very interesting discussions of a couple of chapters, the case studies in the book. So now we'll turn to Professor Daniel Silver, who will give some commentary on the overall book. So, please.
A few random comments.
Yes.
First of all, it's not about war. It's about peace. This book, it's really a tug of peace that we have in this region, where, in my way of thinking, the conflicts, as much as they have produced some military clashes, are actually pretty well managed, either by intention or by default. You can picture much bigger wars than the ones that have been fought so far in this region. So it's a case of, it's hard to say well-managed conflicts because there's nobody sitting there managing them well. But one way and another, the powers in the region have managed to come to some what look like temporary accommodations that avoid much larger conflicts, but nevertheless don't lead to resolution. I've never seen so many chapters of a book that talked about the situation being unripe over and over again. That expression occurs throughout the book. So we have a lot of unripe fruit in this book, but the worst isn't happening. And raises the question of what happens when the really big power in the region, Russia, starts to pursue higher status. And though this concept of status is clearly much larger than security, Russia is seeking that higher status very heavily relying on military means. The reason why Crimea didn't see a war was because there was overwhelming force brought to bear. So the question becomes, there's a kind of irony here, because in Mikhail Troitsky's chapter on negotiating Russia's status in post-Soviet Eurasia, the emphasis is on the sort of broader question of status, but in fact it's being pursued very heavily by military means. What happens when somebody does that? Does that destabilize these kind of ad hoc arrangements that have managed these conflicts? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the region well, but I have a big question mark in my mind, and I'll finish with more of that question. When I read a book of this sort, I always ask myself, what's missing? When we read this book in 2 years or 5 years or in 20 years, what are we going to say they missed? And the one thing that kept on coming to mind as I went through it, because it discusses Russia, it discusses China, it discusses lots of places in between, is that it's missing India. And to me, in the next 30 years, India is the big emerging power. I don't think Russia is. Much as it's seeking status today, Russia is an economy the size of Spain's, I think is the usual comparison, with a declining demography, if I can put it in 2 words, and with a lot of stretch right now in its obligations in Syria and Crimea and Moldova and lots of other places. So In my way of thinking, the missing piece here is the subcontinent. And it seems to me that both economically and militarily, it's likely to be a factor that isn't taken into account in the current fight. Now, mind you, if it takes 30 years for it to become important, that'll be okay. This book isn't about the situation 30 years from now. As I said, I think the big question mark is about what happens in the future and what are appropriate reactions to this Russian push to raise its status in the region and to establish, and the Russian authors in the volume don't mince many words about it, to establish a kind of sphere of influence in what we used to call the near abroad, before it became politically incorrect. And I must say, in that respect, also Igor Eastman's chapter on the question of NATO enlargement is very, very informative. There are so many rather simplified discussions of this issue, and he goes into detail about the changing Russian attitude on NATO enlargement that really, in a way, is extremely enlightening. But it leaves us with this big policy question, especially for the United States, but also for the European Union, also for the states of the region. What is an appropriate policy response when a state tries to increase its status in a region? We face the same problem with China and in the Asia Pacific. And I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's one that we have to realize in all of these smaller areas, what is being negotiated is the future architecture, security architecture, economic architecture of the region. The Caspian has a real impact on what resources are going to be available to Turkmenistan. And the question of whether Crimea remains annexed by Russia or returns to Ukraine is a big and important issue for the security structure in the region. The United States has some very difficult choices to make. I think it fumbled some of those choices when I can't even say it tried to extend NATO membership to Georgia. It kind of stumbled into saying that the door was open, and that created a whole series of reactions. So we have to be very careful, seems to me, to think hard about how strong a role the United States does want to play in this region, how much Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty matter to the United States. The European Union also has to ask that question. And we need to decide which of these conflicts we're prepared to write off and say, you know, as important as this is to Mongolia, it's just not going to engage the United States diplomatically in the way that some of the more important issues will. So there's a big policy issue for the U.S., for the EU, and also I would say for Russia, because Russia has to ask itself, how much of this can I really support? Say the United States withdraws and allows this sphere of influence in the former Soviet states, and even in the Balkans, let us say, how much of that can Russia really sustain? And would that be a good thing for Russia, or would it be a bad thing? So I leave you with those thoughts.
Okay, Terrific. Thanks for the very stimulating and interesting insights. So I think, I do hope to hear some responses from the authors, but maybe what will be best in the half hour remaining is to turn to the audience and maybe take a few questions or comments, and then we can give the floor back to the authors for a response, both to the discussant and to the different remarks. Just ask that you please identify yourself.
Michael Lund, independent researcher at present. In the spirit of Dan's focus on the future, or the present and the immediate future, I wonder, first of all, it's really nice to see collaboration between two programs that I know something about and have followed somewhat. So keep going, doing that stuff. And maybe this question will bring in Henry as well as Mikhail. From your knowledge of Russia's current foreign policy aspirations, but also facing tensions domestically, and assuming that the U.S. steps up to the plate a little bit more in terms of Central Asia and all these issues than it has so far, so that the stakes internationally are raised as against being kind of low-order situations that have not stimulated active, engaged negotiations. What are your views as to the potential for negotiations being attractive to Russia in relation to potentially emerging serious conflicts between the powers? And I'm trying to think of what situations might be potentially explosive. You know more than I do about this, but the Arctic tensions in the Baltic states, how the Central Asian countries resolve border disputes, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on, how China's incursions into the area might present a new factor. So what I'm asking the two of you to address is, given your knowledge of Russia and Putin and so on, what is likely to be the potential for negotiations, such have been more or less successful in some of these cases, but not in others, to be an arena in which some of these disputes can be resolved between the U.S. or the West, and how about the role of the OSCE? I hope that's clear.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's take a couple more if we have some time. Yes, please.
Bill Corkin with Land. Terry, with the negotiation in Ukraine, or about Ukraine, we have a European-led negotiating process, as you described. And we now have a kind of parallel but supportive track between the United States and Russia. Does past negotiating experience or theory offer any insights in whether a construct like that has been successful or likely to be successful?
Okay. Do we have any more? Maybe take one more. Oh, if not, okay, let's go ahead and turn things back to the authors, and we can have another round afterwards if there's time. So maybe we'll just start in the order in which we went originally. So.
Yeah, so I'll address your question about the potential for Russia to start negotiating sort of in good faith on the conflict that we describe and analyze in Eurasia. That's not only post-Soviet Eurasia, that's post-Soviet Eurasia plus a little bit. We are going a little bit beyond post-Soviet Eurasia. Well, I see, at least at this moment, four kind of scenarios in which Russia and its counterparts can begin, substantive, or can continue, advance rather, substantive negotiation on those contentious issues. Well, the first scenario is one in which Russia's aspirations are met. NATO says, okay, we are really not interested in any further enlargement. The open door is there. It sort of remains the cornerstone of our policy, but we don't see where and how we could enlarge, for example. Or, there's a certain commitment undertaken on the part of Russia and the United States, as I think a reported July 2017 proposal went. The proposal brought to the United States by a ranking Russian official, whereby Russia and the United States would have committed not to interfere into each other's domestic affairs, something to that effect, and then the United States turned that kind of proposal down. So if that is accepted, then apparently Moscow will be interested in negotiating other issues, let's say, once one of its supposed concerns is met. But this scenario doesn't look realistic at this moment. Of course, the open door is there. Negotiating non-interference is difficult because of compliance issues and verification issues, indeed, especially in the cyber domain, and so forth. So that's not a viable option. Then the second option could be one in which the second scenario is one in which the pressure on Russia increases to the extent of Moscow not being able to actually deny its involvement in conflicts, or just to pull its to drag its feet on negotiating in good faith. Well, that's possible if the United States assumes a very tough stance on Russia, and we need to see how these sanctions laws actually play out eventually, and whether President Trump can sustain his positive perspective or positive expectations of U.S.-Russia relationship, given the increasing pressure on himself, and potential revelations that are yet to come. So that is kind of likelier than the first scenario, but again, Russia has been able to kind of follow its line in those conflicts, not just over the last 3 years since the real conflict over Ukraine began, and then it sort of proliferated to other regions and issues, but Russia has been kind of holding on for a couple of decades now at least, and it may well be able to hold on for longer, even if there's concerted pressure brought to bear on Russia by the United States, perhaps also European Union / NATO, some Asian allies of the United States, and so forth. Now, the third option is, of course, the third scenario is one in which Russia begins rethinking its long-term approach to relations with the West, and the West sort of starts thinking along the lines of Donald Trump, saying a new reset could be very helpful for a number of reasons, and then perhaps some changes of mutual identities come into play, whereby Russia kind of stops considering NATO as a threat to its survival, and becomes more kind of less concerned with whatever potential regime change efforts it fears on the part of the United States and its allies. Well, the likelihood of that scenario, I think, is somewhat similar to the likelihood of the second scenario. And then the fourth scenario is one in which at least Russia, but maybe both Russia and its counterparts, really start facing some hard choices in the conflicts across post-Soviet Eurasia. If those conflicts really spin out of control, let's say, and if both sides, and especially Russia, feels that it no longer has a handle on, for example, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I mean, that's a nightmare choice for Russia. Nagorno-Karabakh, if the fighting begins, real real hot war starts, then I mean, what side should Russia be taking? And if it fails to really stop the fighting, then it's a very hard choice. And the same might happen in Eastern Ukraine and perhaps in other places like Central Asia, for example, where at the end of the day Russia might not be able to put down major conflict. Major conflict escalation rounds, and then Russia and its counterparts, be it NATO, the United States, China, the European Union, will need to kind of come together to manage those conflicts, and we indeed have that experience with regards to Afghanistan some 15, 17 years ago. So these are my four scenarios in which negotiations could take place, and but of course there's no time to elaborate any further on the likelihood and the interplay.
Okay, thanks. Professor Sarman.
Yeah, building up what Mikhail has said and on Dan's question, I think there are three models of relationships along the edge of Russia. Very simply, black, white, and gray. That is, either Russia pushes to intensify its dominance and influence, and this can either take the place of dominance over sovereign countries or actually biting away pieces, as in the case of Donbass in Ukraine, Donbass and Crimea in the Ukraine. Or, call that black if you want, the white scenario would be the reverse, in which the United States, the West, pushes now to take these newly liberated areas and engage them in a Western or a non-Russian sphere of influence, and we have examples of these, as Dan has mentioned, the attempt to bring Georgia and indeed Ukraine into NATO, the NATO expansion idea. And it seems to me that the chances of the chances of real conflict, including armed conflict, are increased the more either of these is pushed. The more either Russia wants to very much to take over pieces, such as in the case of Donbass or Abkhazia, you will, or the contrary, the way if the NATO expansion is pushed, and that they are reactions to each other. Certainly, one can say that the Russian support in Abkhazia and Ossetia, South Ossetia, and probably in Ukraine, in a sense, were the reactions to the NATO expansion idea that now we've won the Cold War, so let's take over what's left over and include it in our own. Very undiplomatic moves from either side, and as undiplomatic moves inviting a response of the same nature from the other side. The gray idea is the revival in some form or another, and I think it probably includes several of Mikhail's scenarios, of some buffer state, neutralized area, not ours but not yours, neutralization of Cambodia, for example, as was done in the Vietnam War. In which decent relations are held with either side, but conflicts arise, and then within that situation, knowing that each side signaling to the other that they're not out for a takeover, the chances of negotiation are much improved. These signals to the other side that we're not interested in takeover, of course, like any signals, can be interpreted and may be seen as just a smoke screen or as a bluff, or as something that an internal party might turn into something stronger. So the gray, as in the nature of gray, is not as sharply defined, leaves itself open to lots of possibilities. But that's the nature of negotiation, after all. And the chances then, I think, of working carefully within this area, which take very different forms in various, particular parts of the area, the chances of continuing negotiation are important. As Kissinger said, we should get ourselves used to the idea that there will always be foreign policy. There's not going to be a stable situation, but rather the gray area is creative instability, whereas the black and white areas are dangerous.
Thank you. Professor Hoffman.
Let me take up a little bit the question of the possibility of Russian border extension that Dan raised, and also put it in the context of what might be done in some sense to modify the facts on the ground that might move things a little bit closer to the possibility of more serious negotiations. Recently, of course, we've had some proposals, including one from the Russian Federation, to have a UN-authorized peacekeeping force sent to eastern Ukraine, to Donbass, largely to protect the SMM, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission of 700 monitors. In the fall, one of the monitors for the first time was killed and two others injured. It happened to be an American who was killed when their vehicle hit a mine. They were not directly involved in the conflict, and of course, nonetheless, this is obviously restricted where they can travel and what they can observe because of the danger of mines and other kinds of violence that might affect them. Now, the U.S. has rejected this proposal, but I think it misses 2 points here. One is a number of Europeans, at least I talked with when I was in Vienna in November, did believe that this Russian proposal might be an attempt by Russia to try to begin to find a face-saving way out of this mess. That maybe the Russian government is now realizing that it's a no-win situation for them as well. But on the other hand, they can't just kind of give up. They're looking for a face-saving way out, and maybe the creation of some kind of international peacekeeping force might be a way to transition to bring an end to the violence on the ground that might then enable Minsk to move ahead with the implementation that was called for in the Minsk II agreement. Now, obviously, the SMM is stationed throughout the entire combat region, heavily, of course, along the line of contact, but all the way back to the official legal Russian-Ukrainian border. So in some sense, a peacekeeping force that's protecting the SMM is also operating throughout the entire region. Now, the U.S. preference, of course, has been to have a peacekeeping force on the official Russian-Ukrainian border, the now somewhat disputed border. That might be a reasonable proposal, it seems to me, as an end goal, if in fact the Minsk agreement to reestablish the border becomes effective, but until that time, that doesn't seem to me to be as useful as the possibility, in fact, of doing something at least that might help to bring an end to the actual violence now in the zone of contact and surrounding it, which then might enable us to move forward with a little bit more serious negotiation. Now, on the question of the U.S. role, I mean, there are several problems here. One is, I think it was unfortunate in some ways that the Normandy process left the United States out, or the United States opted out. It's not clear which was the case. That is, whether this was largely a U.S. preference to be left out, and the decision Obama made at Normandy, or whether this was the Europeans essentially saying, U.S. butt out of this, it's not really your issue so much. But in any case, I think it was unfortunate that the United States has not had a more significant role. And getting a more significant role for the United States, of course, is complicated. And the separate track is further complicated by the fact that I think it's very hard for the Russians, as it is for most Americans, to figure out just what American policy is towards Russia. I mean, at the beginning, we had Tillerson saying that, for the American voters, Ukraine wasn't worth anything, and so we just ought to kind of forget it. And then, of course, he's now changed his position, and certainly he did when he went to the OSCE ministerial in early December in Vienna, made a big point about the Russian violations and so forth, and et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, we have a president who won't criticize Russia. And part of the problem is, of course, that now this has gotten kind of into the American political debate in a weird way, it seems to me. You know, liberals now, who used to be more for compromise and negotiation, find themselves having to criticize Russia as an indirect means of criticizing Trump. And Trump won't criticize Russia, and therefore conservatives who would otherwise be hardliners are somehow pushing for, you know, on the other side on this coin. And the result is that I think everybody's mixed up about what the U.S. position is, including the U.S. government, as far as I can tell at least. So, I mean, I think that makes it very, very difficult for the United States, frankly, right now, to become an effective negotiating party here, if we don't have a clear position and can't get a consensus position at the core of the U.S. government. You know, what is going to be our role here? And can we play a constructive role? And do we run the risk of having two separate channels that work in very opposite directions? If the U.S. could bilaterally somehow support what the Europeans are doing, that would be one thing. If the U.S.-Russia bilateral dialogue is taking one track and the Normandy format dialogue is taking another track, I think we run a real danger of making the situation worse and making it far harder to, and having then Russia, of course, playing the two parties against one another in some sense as well, making it far more difficult to come up with any kind of change in the facts on the ground that might enable us to open more serious negotiations on actually implementing the principles that have already been agreed to at Minsk II. I mean, many people forget that in fact the formula for an agreement is there. And all the parties agreed to it at Minsk II. The problem is getting the parties on the ground to stop fighting so that we can actually start implementing and working on the details of what was agreed to in what seems to me to be a perfectly reasonable formula for a solution that was arrived at in February 2015, but we have yet to actually make it work.
Did you want to comment on it?
I'll just comment that with status comes responsibility. And I think Washington has to remember that, and I think Moscow has to remember that.
Okay, maybe just in response to Michael Lund's question, I mean, I'll comment very briefly on the domestic considerations, I think, you know, that might be pushing or pulling Putin away from negotiating in good faith. I mean, I'd certainly, you know, defer to what, you know, Mikhail and the others have said about the importance of different scenarios and contingencies and contexts. I mean, I guess kind of if one were to paint the broadest possible picture of domestic incentives, I mean, obviously Putin is insulated from them to a considerable degree, but he does pay a lot of attention to public opinion. I mean, my perspective is that the sort of importance of anti-American rally around the flag effects is exaggerated, you know, in Russia. And that, you know, they've tried to use these at different times to prop up support for the regime, but they haven't really worked at different scenarios. So, you know, the protests broke out in fall of 2011 in the midst of a, you know, very serious, you know, kind of campaign of anti-Americanism. It didn't stop the collapse of United Russia. That doesn't mean it has no effect, but I think that if one looks at kind of what the Russian public thinks, you know, as far as I can tell from my own research and research of others, you know, there's a broad perception that the you know, United States, in particular the West, is a threat. They see it as hostile. But if you ask the other question of kind of how then Russia should react to the West, they want partnerly relations. So if you give them alternatives such as, you know, treat the West as a rival, as an enemy, as a partner or a friend. You know, they kind of write off friendship as unrealistic and impossible, but, you know, kind of a partner, somebody with whom you can work together for some kinds of common interests, I think is what your average, you know, Russian citizen wants. I mean, obviously there are different interests involved, and within the elite there are different interests, but I think the point is, I think that if Putin wanted to negotiate seriously on certain issues, he could find the domestic coalitions for that, both at the level of the masses and probably mostly at the level of the masses, but also you know, at the level of elites, and sort of then beyond that, I think it just depends a lot on the issue. You know, Crimea, something obviously he's dug in his heels. I mean, I don't see any possibility for you know, good faith negotiations on that. You know, and even the conflict in Ukraine itself seems to be a difficult one. But if one talks about like issues like the Arctic, you know, which aren't as sensitive, I think there's a lot of room for cooperation. I think, you know, one of the things that Putin has reaped support for amongst the public and amongst the elite as well is making Russia an effective international presence, being a big player in the world, and that involves also being able to strike deals with the rest of the world, not only to provoke conflict. And so again, I think you pursue deals where he thinks that dealing is really sort of necessary and where he doesn't see his own core interests at stake. So Crimea probably out, but someplace like the Arctic and certain other issues, maybe kind of North Korea or other things like that, I would see much more amenability to good faith negotiations. Again, that's kind of setting aside a lot of the broader contextual factors that the others have mentioned. So I think we have time for one or two final kind of comments or questions for the authors if there are such. So throw it out to people. Yes, please. Just identify yourself.
My name is Ruslan Kirikov. I'm teaching law and politics, Russian law and politics at American University. So I teach at American University. And my question is about the definition of negotiations. So it was mentioned here that sometimes parties, they're more powerful, less powerful, and they come together to negotiate different issues. So, can you hear me?
You're a little loud.
So, yeah, and the question is the linkage between negotiations itself as a process in general and the equality. So is there a precondition of equality between the parties when they come to negotiate some issues in the different regions? Or we can call these kind of communications, when they are unequal, another kind of, not a negotiation, another kind of communication. Why I'm asking this question, because I'm doing a research on the Arctic development, and there are also called negotiations between indigenous communities and the mining companies, but they are unequal. And I'm trying to find a kind of better definition for this process of communication between these, I would say, unequal parties. So that's why just general, maybe there is a definition that is recognized in the international community. What are the negotiations, and what about the equality of the parties?
Okay, well, I think that question is probably enough to take us through the last 3 minutes. So let's turn back to the authors, just any of you who want to respond briefly to that. So.
Well, I can just, of course, there's Professor William Zartman and Professor Hoffman and Professor Server who have dedicated much of their professional careers to distinguished careers to studying negotiation. I'll just be very brief. I do think that you don't need equality to pull off negotiation. It's of course, one approach would be to look at negotiation as basically a reflection of the results of negotiation as a reflection of the distribution of power or distribution of forces, and then negotiation as a form of collective decision making is kind of rid of substance as long as you can predict the outcome based on the distribution of forces. But I mean, that would be a grave oversimplification. Then we would have not witnessed any negotiation taking place at all. So another approach would be to consider identity as a driving force of negotiation. I think the Arctic is a very good case where there's this common identity that drives negotiation and that drives this give and take that Professor Zartman was just referring to as the major sort of descriptor of the negotiation process. So their common identity sort of forces them to leave behind the disparities in status and power when they come to the negotiation table and engage in good faith on some issues, not only of mutual interest, but on the issues that it would be appropriate for them, given their identities, to sort of engage on and to work out, right? So I'll stop here, and of course others will be able to address that in.
Well, the question of equality depends on equality of what? I mean, if we're measuring equality in terms of military power, economic power, that's one set of considerations, but the power of commitment to an issue, the power of what power matters, even in military and economic terms, on the ground in the specific location matters a lot. Why did Panama do so well negotiating with the United States over the Panama Canal Treaty? There was a great asymmetry of power there, and yet they had local power and a much greater commitment than the United States, which was engaged in a whole series of international negotiations with the Soviets over strategic weapons and in the Middle East with Camp David and everything else, whereas it was the political issue in Panama, for example. So again, commitment the values, the identities that are at stake here, the more subjective elements of power need to be taken into account, it seems to me, when we talk about equality and how equality plays out. There's also a whole series of mechanisms which Bill has written about, and maybe he can talk about as well, where even those that are weaker can find various mechanisms to try to nonetheless borrow power in various ways.
Final comments on the topic?
I thought I said well, but at least.
We know a lot about the question that you're talking about, and what we know is sometimes contradictory. The social psychological experiments have shown that equality is the most favorable condition to negotiation. But we also know that in reality, you can never get equality. And we know that the closer one gets, all negotiations are asymmetrical in part from what Terry has said, because there are different elements of power involved, and we can be strong in one aspect and weak in another aspect, back and forth. But we also know that the closer you get to equality, the more unstable or the more hostile negotiations become. And that is very understandable, because the closer you get to equality, the closer each side gets more concerned about maintaining its element of equality, that is its closeness or its slight edge that it has over the other party. So negotiations in near symmetry become negotiations for position before they become negotiations about issues. So if you add this up, how do you come out? And one way of coming out that's very helpful is that it's important for negotiating parties to develop to extend a sense of equality to the other side. Not to put them down, but rather to assure them of the equality. And there are many examples in the U.S.-Soviet relations where it was very important, the United States, in particular issues where it was in a stronger position, assuring the Soviet Union that we're equals here. We're static. We recognize your position. And that kind of lesson is very important now, I think, in dealing with Russia. Instead of saying, well, we're the last remaining superpower, to say, you had a great past in superpower as well, and you have a great status, and so on. Therefore, to increase the notion of equality, even though we all know perhaps that if you took a vote or something like that, one would be heavier than the other. By the same token, too, and this is very important beyond our issue in dealing with, for example, internal conflicts, where very often we try to put down the domestic rebellion as not really being important as having standing, whereas what's important is to give them recognition that the problem wouldn't exist without them, that they're a party to the problem. And therefore, when Golda Meir said, who are the Palestinians, she was blocking off negotiations. And when the Palestinians have maps that show no Israel, they're blocking off negotiations because they're questioning the legitimacy and standing of the other side. So it's a mixed situation that we know rather solidly about equality, but the idea of giving the other side a sense of equality is very important.
All right. Well, thank you all for sharing this wrap-up of the first work week of 2018 with us. And please join me in thanking authors and discussant and editor for a great volume, which I think will be important and influential, and which will be out officially when?
In the US, it will be possible to order it beginning January 26th or 29th. But I think you can already order an ebook, and order forms and flyers are freely available. We can print out more if necessary.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting us.